Welcome to this webinar on such an important point about supporting infrastructure support groups. We have a wonderful panel and a lot of interest in this webinar. It's being recorded and then it'll be available on our YouTube channel in about a week or so. So if you want to download it and use it, then feel free to do so. I'm just trying to see how many people are coming in. Can we just wait a minute until we get a few more people in? Okay, well, let's start. All right, so what I'm going to do is just introduce the chair, Renee Hoare from C. Hoare & Co. Renee, thank you for chairing this, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you in advance to the panel. I think we're set for a really exciting session. So I'm Rennie Hoare. I'm partner and head of philanthropy at Hoare's Bank, and also the chair of Philanthropy Impact. So this discussion of philanthropy infrastructure, I come into contact with in a number of different guises. I think a lot of certainly the Philanthropy Impact membership, and even those that are funding philanthropy, look at it through the lens of different specific cause areas, whether it being amazing organizations that deal with environmental causes, looking at very, very specialized interventions around mental health. A lot of people's viewpoint around philanthropy is those types of charities, those types of enabling organizations. However, underpinning it are these amazing bits of infrastructure. And this type of infrastructure gets a very small amount of airtime. It really doesn't get looked at very frequently. So this session is a chance to draw out the expertise of some excellent practitioners that can really guide us through this underlooked at area. And I thought I'd quickly just scene set about what I mean by infrastructure. Really, these are the platforms, the partnerships, the networks, the stuff that operates so that there is the possibility for those charities to operate on top. They are the maximizers of funding. They allow £1 to turn into £10. It crosses a whole different swathe of vehicles. So it might well be donor advised funds. There are funding platforms. There are things like Penny's Foundation, which is helping people doing roundup giving. There's a huge amount of different ways that this can be attacked, but all of them are absolutely vital for getting the most amount of money to those incredible end causes. So today we're going to speak with 4 panelists that really know their stuff in this area. I'm going to do a good amount of Q&A with them, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end to pull some questions out of the Q&A box from the people that are on the line. So I hope that we can get that level of interactivity across all of it. So without further ado, I'm going to get each of the panelists to do a quick introduction of themselves so that you can have the context of their expertise, and then we'll kick into it. So Victoria, if I could please start with 30 seconds from you.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me today. I'm Victoria Vrana. I'm the CEO of an organization called Global Giving. We're a nonprofit. We've been around a little over 20 years, and we basically connect donors to the causes and organizations they care about in 175 countries. We have an online giving platform, so anyone can go to globalgiving.org and pick a cause, pick a project, pick an organization and support it. But we also move a lot of money behind the scenes for corporate philanthropy and high capacity donors. We vet organizations to know that they're safe and trusted and fully compliant with cross-border giving regulations. And so last year, for example, we moved about $84 million to 8,000 projects in 160 countries. And the funds came from 150,000 people. So we're really trying to build a diverse revenue stream for local grassroots organizations all over the world. I joined Global Giving 2 years ago, and before that, I spent 11 years at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation managing, among many things, our sector infrastructure investments. And so I'm kind of bringing two hats to this conversation today. One as a funder who led multi-million-dollar investments in sector infrastructure, and now as a part of the sector infrastructure. So really happy to share what I've learned over time with all of you.
Thank you, Victoria. And I think that's already a little bit of a snapshot into that discussion of scale that we will be drilling down into. Peter, if I could please turn to you.
Sure. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm Peter Brock. I also wear two hats. One is a funder, and the other is I founded Propel Philanthropy, which it consists of probably now maybe 80 to 100 social impact infrastructure organizations that receive materials from us. What I have done basically over the last 6 years is almost exclusively given to provide capacity support for social impact infrastructure organizations, because they in turn very often can have almost like an exponential impact if they're able to, if the giving is done in a catalytic way. And I've had some fairly remarkable experiences doing this, and I would like to share it with others. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. We look forward to getting into those practical examples, because I think that transition into something that can seem quite theoretical into actually what it looks like in practice is going to be vital. Rachel, if I could come to you, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rennie. And yeah, thank you to Philanthropy Impact for hosting this panel and for everyone who's joining. So I'm Rachel Hughey. I'm a senior officer at the Hilton Foundation. And the Hilton Foundation is based here in Los Angeles, California. We are both a global and domestic funder. So we fund across 7 initiative areas all across the world and right here in our own community as well. But to Rennie's point, I have a unique role in the foundation in that I sit in the executive office and invest in what we think of as cross-cutting issues. And infrastructure is certainly something that we consider to cut across all of the work we do and can be a real amplifier of the impact of our different program initiatives. So I'm excited to dive into that topic with you all today. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you, Rachel. And yes, I think that span of how many different things are touched by infrastructure is going to be great to get a bit more of an insight into. And Chris, if I could please turn to you.
Sure thing. Chris Warman. I'm the Chief Global Strategy and Partnership Officer at Giving Tuesday. I also wear the hat of being the chair of the board of Wings. So my day job sort of spans grassroots generosity all the way through institutional philanthropy. Spent a lot of time in my career working on digital infrastructure development over the last 20 years, and sort of the intersection of community empowerment, digital, and giving. So, pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone.
Amazing. Thank you, Chris. And I think when considering those possible ways of scaling things up, the use of technology, the use of digital tools is absolutely something that we'll want to get a bit more of insight in. So without further ado, I'd love first to turn to you, Peter, and really to think and explore an example where investment in infrastructure has transformed an ecosystem, where it has done that thing that we're talking about and explaining in this introduction.
I would begin with an example that's happened a long time ago, and probably in 1960. The Foundation Center, as it was called at the time, now Candid, put out the Foundation Directory. One of the biggest changes in philanthropic history, because when that came out, and I don't know how much it cost, and I don't know how many initial funders were on board. Whoever got and whoever was, they started something that we cannot count the number of organizations of nonprofits that have benefited from that directory. And that means not just them, but it means human lives, it means environments, it means children who otherwise would not have opportunities. These nonprofits now for the first time had access to a tool where they could find funders and where funders could find them. And there are since then many examples, and prior to that, many examples. And I would be happy to share a few of mine later in the conversation.
And it's amazing that just that provision of transparency and access can be such an enabler. We've certainly seen some very good examples here in the UK with 360 Giving and platforms that provide that visibility. But that's interesting that you're seeing it as one of the first and very strongest examples of providing infrastructure support. Rachel, if just thinking of your work, it really spans quite a lot of different facets, the locally led development and sector support. When looking at the different things that you're trying to achieve, how do you weigh up those competing priorities when you're putting in place infrastructure? Is it the same needs for all of them, or do you even have to tailor the infrastructure to be able to make it fit for purpose?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I think that as you kind of outlined in the beginning of this presentation, infrastructure encompasses a lot of different types of work, right? So you have everything from funding platforms to kind of what Peter was talking about, how do you even identify information about giving? And that maybe is a good example of where what you would look for might be different if you were funding an organization based in the United States where we are, or in the global context. Because I think the first thing that you have to think of whenever you're funding infrastructure is an assessment of what's happening in the field already, right? So infrastructure should always be connected to existing policies, programs, and infrastructure. I think that in philanthropy, particularly in large institutional philanthropy, sometimes we have the habit of wanting to create something new and exciting with our name on it. And so the first thing I would urge funders to do is to assess what already exists and what can we build on and connect to. And then I think with your note, so I actually manage 3 separate portfolios, which are focused on equity here in the United States, what we call locally led development globally, which is kind of access to resources for small local organizations. And then what we call sector strengthening, which is investing in philanthropic sector and a lot of infrastructure. But the principles of those portfolios, I think, really stretch across all of what we do. And so, no duplication is one I would always advocate for. The second would be to center providing access to organizations that have been, or people, individuals, communities that have been previously disenfranchised. That's something you should be thinking about whenever building infrastructure. Does this either build access, increase access, or unintentionally reduce access? And we have some examples of both of those. And then I would also be thinking about who are the voices in the room that are informing the development of that infrastructure. So that's one of the core principles that the Hilton Foundation adheres to, is the communities that are being served and being reached should have a voice in shaping the programs that they're having access to. And I can go into more, but I feel like I've already talked for quite a while, so I'll pass it to you. But those are some of the principles and the things that we're weighing when we're thinking about infrastructure. Just one last parting note, because I can't stop talking, is another really important role that infrastructure plays is that coordinating piece. So thinking about, whenever I talk to anyone, Victoria and I have already had this conversation, Chris and I have had this conversation for a long time. Usually the first question I ask is, who else are you talking to? Who else are you working with? And that's such an important role for a sector that's often very fragmented and siloed. So that's kind of another piece that I look at when looking at investments.
And just thinking of your point on things that can inhibit access and things that are real maximizers and can drive it forwards, I'd love to have an example of each, and maybe even a surprising example of the things that could inhibit, because getting those types of insights where people could do things which inadvertently trip over the things they're trying to enable would be incredibly useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Within the infrastructure space, I'd say one, one live example of something that I think we're all going to need to increasingly think about is we exist in an era of closing civic space, right? Globally and here in our own context as well. And as Peter mentioned, like the major infrastructure that we use to fund organizations is charitable status. And if organizations are registered with their governments, TechSoup plays a big role in this, Chris, overseas, as you know well, in identifying organizations. But that inherently excludes certain community-based organizations that aren't able to access kind of the legal necessities to become registered. And so that's a way that the existing infrastructure kind of inhibits inclusion. And so I think it's a very live example of folks are thinking through how to overcome that. Things like pooled funds and philanthropic platforms are kind of one way to address that we've the system, the sector has discovered so far, but it's something that I think we're going to have to increasingly be considering in this new era, especially in global development.
Very helpful. Thank you. Victoria, just turning to you, there's you've spent a lot of time looking at that intersection between innovation and how philanthropy sort of interplays in that space. What shifts have you seen taking place, and that movement to even helping support local funders, which it sounds like your platform is almost uniquely designed to be able to assist at real scale?
Yeah, so let me share a little bit about the shifts I've seen in funding infrastructure over time, and then I'll switch to talk about local. So, in the last 20 years or so, I've seen funders come and go into the infrastructure space, which is really challenging for infrastructure organizations. It's difficult for organizations to know which funders are interested in these things, just like any kind of other funding space. And part of that is because infrastructure means a lot of different things. We're talking about policy and data and leadership development and digital strengthening and investments in technology and knowledge sharing and connections and networks. And, just like in any other kind of funding space, funders have their own preferences for which pieces to fund. So for a number of years, I was the co-chair of a US kind of loose body called the Infrastructure Funders Group, which is kind of institutional foundations that all fund infrastructure. And it was a great space because people could trade notes. To Rachel's point, you do not want to reinvent the wheel. So the best thing to do if you're considering funding infrastructure is connect with other people who are doing it. So you can kind of find out what's going on, find out where the needs are, who the organizations are, and how to structure funding. Over time, traditionally, as Peter was talking about Foundation Center, and I think it was Foundations who stood that up in the very first place and who supported, GuideStar and Foundation Center for years. But one of the shifts has been individual funders coming into this space. That's been really exciting. So Mackenzie Scott did a round of infrastructure funding. Some of the DAF trustee funds have been heavy funders in infrastructure because they're kind of cause agnostic, right? They want to help the whole sector. So that's been a big development. I think the most both disappointing and exciting thing I've seen in the space, though, is US funding for infrastructure has been declining slightly in the last like 5 to 8 years. But overseas in emerging philanthropic markets, it is soaring. So last fall, the Hong Kong Jockey Club stood up the Institute of Philanthropy, a think, fund, do tank for infrastructure with an $870 million USD investment. That's the biggest infrastructure investment that's ever been made, as far as I know. And that's all about infrastructure for nonprofits and philanthropy in China and Asia. That's enormous. And so you're seeing that in emerging markets, people really understand the value. So when you talk about local, there are really emerging, exciting, dynamic local associations, local networks. I mean, Chris, as board chair of Wings, you know this. There's like so many local kind of networks springing up and capacity building organizations, but they're brand new and they're starving for funds. So there's a lot of opportunity to support that. And then there are kind of global infrastructure orgs like Wings, like us at Global Giving, that are kind of lifting all boats in many, many places. And again, that focus on locally led right now is essential, because we know that those organizations are just in a world of hurt at this moment. So again, like Rachel, I could talk a lot, so let me stop and I'll throw it back to you, Rennie, and maybe over to Chris.
I think you're preempting it. Well, I think handing over to Chris is going to be very sensible, particularly with that lens on digital, because as we're building out different enablers, how can I know that you've had a deep experience in it, Chris, but just understanding a bit more how those types of tools can help infrastructure be even more successful or even more impactful. I'd love to just start delving into that, please.
Sure. And speaking of infrastructure, they're doing work on the internet in my neighborhood, and it's going in and out. So I'm going off camera for a moment while I speak. Funny challenge to have in an infrastructure conversation. So, I think on this question about digital infrastructure and how it can help or not, to quote William Gibson, the future's here, just unevenly distributed. Where there is good digital infrastructure, and by that I mean connectivity to the internet, people who have tools to transact over the internet, training on how to use it, and there are learning communities to help us understand what's working, you can see exponentially wonderful things. Giving Tuesday is an example of this. 14 years ago was a hashtag. Last year mobilized probably on the order of 50 million people, about $5 billion in resources for local organizations. This was a $752 to every dollar invested returned because of digital. There's no way that could have happened except with the power of the internet. And yeah, that's great. The money is extremely important, but it's also, it's our communications platform for cross-border communications, for communities forming. It's also a way for us to gather data and really understand the cultures of giving that exist and how they're evolving. All of this, again, thanks to digital, but half the planet isn't online. Half. 80% of people couldn't be on this call right now because they don't have bandwidth fast enough. Funny enough, I have fiber at home and I'm struggling to get on this call. So there is this issue about yes, there are wonderful things that can happen. There is a risk, as Rachel raised, about sort of the things that we could pile onto that might actually end up inhibiting or harming in some ways. I'm all for helping people build out digital communities, communications, et cetera. But in our sort of excitement about things like AI and the ways in which the other sort of fancy stuff that rides on top of digital infrastructure can suck attention, can suck donor I would say interest in a particular direction, it presumes that other people have it and they don't. The risk being that we consolidate power, we consolidate reputation, we consolidate narrative around people who already have access. Wings did a report a couple of years ago that 80% of the infrastructure investments for civic infrastructure have happened in the global north. 80%. This is not where it's needed anymore. Yes, there are lots of things we need, but does North America need another fundraising platform? I kind of doubt it. Does the rest of the world need them? Yes. A lot of the world, those coming online, do not have access to the very basic transactional technologies they need to engage their communities in acts of giving and volunteering. They don't have them. We presume they do, and then we wonder why they're not great partners in locally led development, et cetera, on our terms. Again, to some of Rachel's points about being savvy to what's there or not. So I think this is just sort of something that we need to keep in mind. there is an incredible digital future of giving that enables the cultures that we want to see, the sort of strength and resiliency in civil society and society writ large. But there is I would say, a call to action, especially in an era where overseas development assistance has been gutted, to focus on where people do or do not have access to these basic digital infrastructures so that they can be a part of this conversation. Full stop.
It's, I think the framing of how, where you can, even across infrastructure, and acknowledging that it is this amazing enabler, £1 or $1 in the global north might not go as far as in the global south, equivalent to the charities that are on top. So when talking about leverage, I think that's a fascinating additional insight, that you have to look at where there's scarcity of infrastructure and platforms, and that's probably an additional bit of complexity that needs to be absorbed. Peter, I know that you're quite an advocate for advisors, people who can be around philanthropists, helping them edge into this area, helping them get into the how to give to infrastructure. It'd be fascinating to pick out what are the ways that people can edge into it. Do they have to go all guns blazing, or are there sort of much more incremental steps that they can take that allows them to gain confidence and gain understanding?
That's a great question. Absolutely. One of our sayings we have is small grants can drive big results. And that's been my experience over 6 years. All of my grants have been between $17,000 and $100,000, really pretty small compared to, what some of the other people are doing. And I have had phenomenal results. And I operate differently in a different model than Rachel does, in terms of I don't have as many filters that are, specific goals. My goal is hope to rise the tide to raise all boats by hoping that what Rachel and others have talked about can happen, but it doesn't guarantee it. I'm going to give you an example of something that happened with me just very, very recently. And probably about 4 days ago, I got a letter from Humentum. I had provided a $50,000 grant, not a huge amount of money, so that their members could meet. And the coalition came together on 2 different occasions. So they met, they were able to put a plan together. They were able to put that plan out to the remainder funders. And what they are talking about is probably a huge issue, this bottleneck of resources that can't be delivered because of our accounting standards. There's no accounting standards, particularly in the global South, financial standards for nonprofits. And if we can pull this together, the impact I would be in God knows how many billions of dollars. It's a very big deal. And they were able to raise $800,000 because they came together, because they were able to speak as one voice and present. Very simple kind of thing. And I've often run into situations where an organization simply needs an assistant. When he was working for TechSoup, they simply need an assistant. They were at the very end of their campaign, or their capital campaign. They had to raise $11.5 million. They had 8.5 about 4 months before the deadline. I helped them bring on an assistant so that the lead development person could use more time, which she put about 15 hours a week more time toward the campaign. What happened was the day before the campaign, they were about $400,000 short. I mean, it was a really big deal. Because of this, they were able to cross the finish line on the day. And what that meant is hundreds of thousands. This funding goes to helping hundreds of thousands of organizations, of nonprofits, of CSOs in 236 countries globally. And that, so that was a $60,000 grant. So there are times I've had one for 17,000 or 19,000 actually that help increase student involvement in SDG and graduating from a program at about 140%. So there absolutely is a way for people to get in, get their toe in, do things gradually, learn along the way, or join an organization that's already doing it, which is a huge benefit because you can trail on and you can work with them. And I'm sure there are many organizations that would love, foundations that would love to have somebody join them in the work that they're doing.
I mean, I think that's really heartening to hear, that it doesn't have to be large scale, that people can lean into it and can find those very targeted examples. Chris, I'd love to turn to you, as there was some allusion to areas and other examples that you have of where this type of funding can really create some amazing results.
Sure. I've actually just been working on a piece, sort of an op-ed about exactly this topic. And one of the pieces of research that Wings and I were looking at was investment in the infrastructure for giving in Romania, specifically because I'm on the board of something called the Romanian American Foundation. It has invested in Romania in the infrastructure for philanthropy. And it's a clear sort of time-bound case study of where the money went in, what happened, a lot of tracking of the metrics over the last 14 years. And what was interesting in building this case study was that the Romanian American Foundation has invested in a federation of community foundations, so support for community foundations to emerge as a particular kind of infrastructure, 2 online giving platforms in the country, and then training and support work for people to really kind of, within those spaces, learn how to use the tools. There's been $6 million invested in the Federation of Community Foundations over the last 14 years. A lot of that is matching gifts to funds that were raised locally, and then 150,000 each to the 2 platforms. So $6.3 million and some change for training. The return on that has been more than $100 million raised from individuals in Romania in small gifts from several 100,000 Romanians. It has changed the narrative in Romania about what civil society means as a cultural construct, as something that we do. It's not a tax code. Civil society is something we believe in, and it exists because we participate. We know that we're participating when we're giving. That's our expression of faith in the concept. And that they had built that infrastructure and sort of seen that influence how government related to civil society. Again, the amount of money that came to the table, but then everything that really meant in the sector. And this is, again, right now, in a world of closing spaces, we need citizens to stand with and for civil society. We need philanthropy to think about itself as part of civil society. And we need to be building that trust through those interactions. Then there's all of that sort of other infrastructural support that can be built around it. But I think for me, this is particularly important, not just because of thinking about sort of the return on investment, but what that, you've heard me say culture probably 14 times in the last 3 minutes, what this really means as a way of building cultures of solidarity and support that persist and sort of pay off long after those initial investments.
I think that context is really helpful, and the building of things which can endure is fascinating. You did allude a little bit to the removal of funds and how there needs to be a crowding in, the creation of different ways that funds can be disseminated, particularly if you're looking at the global south. Victoria, I'd love to delve into this a little bit more, because looking out into the future, how do we make sure that what we're putting in place is not another set of funding dependencies? They're much more about the building of resilience, which I think Chris talked about, rather than just something that maybe skews over into a different form of control or a different form of dependency.
Yeah, well, that's where infrastructure actually plays its most valuable role, because infrastructure organizations aren't there for themselves. Like take an organization in the US like BoardSource. BoardSource is there to help all nonprofits make their boards stronger and better and more effective. And if you've ever worked in a nonprofit, or if you've ever served on a board, you know that this is like a huge need in the sector, right? And to have a strong, sustainable, lasting, enduring organization, you need strong leadership. Boards are just one part of that, right? But something like BoardSource really can help, like, again, lift all boats and make all organizations stronger. And so whether you're looking at leadership development or policy or digital or knowledge sharing or networking, like, it's the infrastructure organizations that are helping organizations get stronger and sustainable for the long term. Now, when we think about funding and funding sources, you know, obviously organizations around the world are just reeling from some of the changes in the external landscape right now and are needing to urgently look at how to redesign their approach to raising funds. And there's not going to be one magic solution to that. Community philanthropy, like Chris is talking about. So let's take Romania. So Romanians supporting Romanian organizations, that's one huge piece of this puzzle, is really helping develop those local cultures and those pathways for generosity within communities. But there are other important sources as well, like how do local organizations get loans? How do local organizations get impact investing? How do local organizations get access to the foundations that are still giving overseas? How do local organizations get access to diaspora communities and corporate philanthropy that are interested in funding in those communities? That's the role global giving plays. I keep picturing it as this beautiful braid right now, kind of made up of these different strands of money, of capital coming from different sources. Maybe picture
This type of braid.
All shades of green. It's a green braid. But it's really kind of, you know, it's going to take that for organizations to be able to get that different access. And they're going to have to build skills where they don't have them. So if you haven't raised money online from outside, you're going to need to build your capacity. Like, part of infrastructure is capacity, right? And so as a funder, you can fund your individual grantees to build their capacity. I could fund a fundraising professional in an organization I care about, or I could fund strengthening the fundraising capacity for a bunch of grantees, right? Or a whole space, or the whole environmental space. And that's the kind of leveraged investment that goes really far. And it's not an either or, right? You can also do both. So that's the way we should be thinking about how to make sure these investments aren't creating dependencies, because really that's what infrastructure is all about, is making organizations strong and independent.
And Rachel, from the way that you think about things, how do you consider this building of capacity? Is it that you're focusing on the platforms, or because you're dealing in very sort of vulnerable communities, how do you make sure that they're sufficiently understood and that you're really able to create something that's as useful as possible to them?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, everything that Victoria said, like repeating everything she said, I think that's a huge part of this. Especially that last piece about it's going to take multiple approaches, right? There is no silver bullet. There's no one type of infrastructure. There is no one solution to the disappearance of ODA funding. And I think that and philanthropy, quite frankly, will never fill that gap, right? And so I think that funders, you know, wherever you're coming at it from in the sector, have to be really realistic about that. And as I'm thinking about, I mean, your question, I think, was a little bit more about what are we considering. The three themes that keep coming to mind for me, and this is honestly like a very evolving process as the world is changing so rapidly right now, but I'm thinking a lot about how are we investing in people, in institutions, and in relationships, because those are often the things that will sustain regardless of what else changes in the external environment, right? So if you're developing the strength and leadership of people, that also in this context might involve investing in their both physical and digital security of people. You know, we know that across all of our social impact sectors, people are also facing burnout at extremely high rates just due to the strain of being on the front line of this work. So thinking about people, thinking about institutions, how are we again, another trend in philanthropy is that we tend to over projectize grants. And so organizations, including infrastructure organizations, don't always have the resources to invest in their own institutions. So how are we supporting them to do that? And then finally is relationships. And this is one that, you know, when I think about the work that we've invested in as the Hilton Foundation that I've been able to touch over the years, I think a lot of it has succeeded or failed based on the strength of relationships. And that's not something that you can like create a checklist to say, oh, this is a good one or this is a bad one, but it's something you have to develop some institution around. And I think something that funders, you know, if there's anyone on this call who's giving resources, should think about what are ways that we can support relationships to be successful, whether that's funding spaces to bring people together so they can build those in person, or, you know, I think we can get really creative about that. But those are the three things I'm kind of thinking about in this rapidly changing environment. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. I could always say more, but
Yeah. And maybe one for everyone. It seems what we're talking about, could there possibly be two types of funders? There are funders who are funding infrastructure, and there are funders who are then using the infrastructure to then get money to the end causes, and they're passionate about the end causes. Is that too simplistic a bifurcation of things, or is there actually specialism and skill set that you need both of these people to operate, and you shouldn't confuse the two? Victoria, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, sorry to raise my hand. I'm just like eager to jump in on this point. So, you know, I think funders who get super passionate and jazzed up about infrastructure are folks who have a systems view. Like if you're kind of a direct service person who just really wants to directly impact individual people or the planet or the creatures who live on it, then you lean with your heart more to the programmatic piece. Like that's what really gets you excited. But if you're a systems person who thinks in this way, those are the funders I've seen get really excited about infrastructure. So, and there may not be as many of those. So how do you get the heart direct program people interested in infrastructure? I think it starts with their own grantees. So let's say you have a cohort of 10 organizations working on, I think I saw somebody mention refugees in the chat, and you really care about really supporting refugees. So then you look at those 10 organizations and you think, what's some common need that they all have? Maybe you talk to them about it, right? And you look at, like, as Rachel said, maybe you create the space for them to come together. I can't tell you how expensive it is, like now running a nonprofit versus being in a foundation. It costs a lot of money to fly around and get together. And it's money that organizations often don't have. And so, you know, that can be a light touch thing, helping those 10 organizations do scenario planning in this time of crazy change. Like that can be an infrastructure investment. So if you start with your own grantees and then you get to see the power of, to Peter's point, a small investment can go a long way to help all of these 10 hypothetical refugee grantees, right? So that's one piece. There's another easy piece. It's hard for organizations to participate in the infrastructure. So I'll give you an example. Like we at Global Giving are members of the Council on Foundations because we're a grant maker. And we are having a tight year this year, and we almost canceled our membership in the council because it's a few $1,000s. And you know, the council has been my lifeline in this time of policy change, and I'm so glad we didn't do it. But those membership fees and infrastructure organizations, traveling to conferences, like enabling your grantees to be able to benefit from infrastructure organizations, that can be a baby step, right? That can be a first step. And then you yourself can see that value really powerfully. So I'd recommend dabblers to kind of try that space.
I think that's really helpful, actually. Just thinking of, are there tools which those end grantees can be plugged into that allow them to really benefit? I suppose the flip side of opportunity is risk, and thinking about how then can funders act in ways that de-risk? How can they do things that creates that sharing of best practice that enables for what can be quite high risk grant making to have that risk syndicated and shared out? Peter, I know this is an area that you've got a lot of focus and expertise, and it'd be great to just dig a little bit more into that. How can you control risk? How as a funder should you be thinking it through?
That's probably a key question that's on all of our minds. I love what Victoria said, because in her example actually is a de-risking example. She's talking about a situation where 10 organizations, they all need to network together. I use that example, all those organizations that came together to be able to raise that $800,000. And, these organizations need to come together. There are 10 of them. One of them may fall off, 2 of them might fall off, but you got 8 left. So you're putting in your money to help 10 organizations. That's a fairly good investment, as I would say. Another thing I would also urge us to think about, along with what Chris's point about, needing to reduce the digital divide, is that right now, being able just to help if organizations or a group of organizations be able to invest in AI, and training them, because there is so much happening so quickly. I just can't imagine that being a high risk investment. I think that can be fairly safe. You get involved in the AI space, you train a whole bunch of organizations within a network, you could probably do pretty well. You can pool with other organizations, or with other people. You can develop partnerships. You share the risk. You can put it. What I've done often is I've created challenge grants, and I've said, I can put out this much, have somebody else put out, the rest. That lessens my exposure. I can get involved in a giving circle. So we have a group of people working together on a project, so that we get so many more different minds and perspectives on it. And that's another way. So there are a whole group of ways that you can lessen the risk. And one of my things that I do is I think of myself as a venture philanthropist. And that means that I will pick something big. Like right now, I'm looking at what Chris is doing with Giving Tuesday, and we're talking about, if we can raise $300,000, it's possible that we could raise $1 billion, for Giving Tuesday. And that's a situation where you bring 5 funders together, for example, each puts in $50,000. We don't know it for certain. There's no absolute guarantees, but we're not each putting in so much that it really is going to really crush our bank accounts. And you get in these situations, unlike venture philanthropists, who often have to put in a large amount of money for a much larger result, you can put in a relatively small amount of money and then put it for something that could be truly huge, like raising $1 billion or something of that sort. And I've run into a whole lot of those kind of situations in my career.
I mean, quite exciting to just think of that leverage point of a few people that are coming together and syndicating smaller amounts for a really big prize like that. Rachel, I'd love to just explore a bit more around then where there's the opportunity for these quite big targets. Quite often funders get drawn back into stuff that's short-term measurement. And how do you play off these big goals, these big things that can be achieved, against possibly a tendency to be too focused on metrics which don't really cover an appropriate time period?
I think you named one of the most prominent tensions in kind of institutional philanthropy today, Rennie, is that a lot of, at least in the United States, philanthropy, the history of it comes from the business world, right? These are folks who have made their money in businesses, and our boards are often led by business professionals. And so this idea that you could have kind of quarterly or annual or even 3-year returns or outcomes on your projects. But as we all know on this call, social impact just doesn't necessarily operate on those time horizons. I think folks have gotten really smart about thinking about how to measure progress towards goals, right? There's always kind of intermediate outcomes that you can be looking for. I think we can be really creative about how we're thinking about impact and change. But I think a lot of these large investments, you're looking at, 10-year time horizons or longer. And so
Hmm.
I know this is an active conversation within our institution is how to kind of extend our viewpoint. And I think it's going to take some real shift in how the sector thinks about its work. And, Chris, I think spoke earlier a little bit about the narrative for civil society and how we need a shifting narrative. He was talking in the Romanian context, but I think that's equally true here in the United States and probably anywhere that you're working, or that, any of our participants are working. And so I would just encourage us all to be promoting that narrative as individuals and sharing that we think this is a long, complicated path towards change. It's going to have ups and downs, and I think the sector needs to start to make those shifts. We're seeing with the new group of donors coming out. Victoria mentioned Mackenzie Scott obviously has created a lot of splash, but things like that, giving unrestricted and giving without expectation of immediate change. I would suggest people think more about. Chris, I saw you come off mute.
Yes, please jump in.
Are you gonna tell me that I
Sure.
don't do this? Is that
No. No. I think one thing that is worth thinking about is sort of the mind shift that needs to happen within philanthropy about infrastructure from the perspective that we all get a free ride on infrastructure that somebody else has paid for before us. The failures, the challenges we have are often because we have not chosen to pay for it. We are all responsible for the infrastructures that we rely on, which has led some people to say, oh, do we need a philanthropy tax? Do we need to add like 2% out of everybody's philanthropy budget, out of the 5% in some cases? We're not talking about a lot. We're talking about an incremental amount going into a pooled fund that would then actually fund the infrastructures everyone needed. That is a really hard sell, but it sort of more raises the point that we do need to be thinking creatively about this. And I think some of it in this, like, getting everyone to accept responsibility for this conversation, not just assume the benefits of this conversation and then complain when something doesn't work out the way we wanted it to. Part of what it sort of struck me in this conversation might be a step. I think there are a couple of research investments that would be useful to make as a sector. One is something analogous to what Wings did with the climate call to action, where it wasn't just saying, hey, philanthropy, climate's going to be an issue for you, but it actually laid out very specific ways for philanthropy to understand how it could engage in this conversation, from minimally to maximally, lots of different ways. And what's so important about that was it was tangible. And when we're in this conversation, we're talking about philanthropy as if it's one thing. We all know it isn't. We're also talking about infrastructure as if it's one thing, and it isn't. And having some sort of guide that says from physical to digital to knowledge to reputational, what are the different forms of infrastructure we're actually invested in as a sector, and how might one get more engaged with whom? Who is working on these issues? That's not an unimaginable research project at all. So I think there's something like that that could really help us clarify as a sector what the conversation is. Another piece that I think is really necessary at this point is then taking that and doing a global research project to understand where these infrastructures do and do not exist, so that we're not talking hypothetically about solving for infrastructure gaps. We are looking at this in a targeted roadmap fashion to say, we need the investments over here. As I said earlier, the US doesn't need another online giving platform right now, but there are all sorts of parts of the world that do. Could all of us name where those are? No, 100% couldn't. I know a bunch. Victoria probably knows a bunch. Rachel probably knows a bunch. But is that collective knowledge? No. And so where that leaves us is still with this hypothetical conversation instead of a practical one, to actually start making those small and medium-sized bets that have the sort of outsized return that Peter's been sort of advocating for a long time here. So I do think there are a couple of pieces of like specific research that could be done for helping this whole community understand its responsibility and then what to do about it.
I think good that the outcome is more infrastructure for infrastructure. Victoria, I'd
You've
love
got to start somewhere.
It shows. I think it helps give that extra credence the point that it's a leverage point. So even as infrastructure as a leverage point, that it can be better if you design it better, if you think about what it is enabling and the tools that it requires. Victoria, you came off mute to...
Yeah, just a super quick concrete example on the measurement front. So when I was at Gates, we had investments in policy for the sector, like advocating for a favorable policy and regulatory environment. And we invested multi-year investments in 5 organizations. And my superiors said, how are we measuring our effectiveness? What are they doing on policy? How do we know if we have a win? How do we know if they're stopping things? And these organizations didn't have robust measurement frameworks. And so I funded an evaluation firm to work with each of them to create measurement frameworks. And then, we said, if you can find some common metrics, great, but you don't have to, but it'd be great if you did. And sure enough, after 6 months, they had beautiful measurement frameworks they used for themselves, with their boards, for us, and for other funders. So it is possible to measure this stuff. It just, again, it may be that the organizations themselves don't have the capacity to do it yet. So you can fund it. If you need the measurement, you can fund the measurement. So just keep that in mind.
And I think that bit of trying to find something that's fit for purpose, quite often it resides inside the organization. If you go and engage, put the tools around it, and you get engaged properly with it, actually that can be an amazing way of drawing out the insight rather than coming with a set template of this is the way that everyone needs to act. With that, I think we've managed really rather a successful canter round. I see John looming in the wings, ready to pose us one final and extremely important question. So, John, I'll hand over to you.
Well, thank you, Renee. This has been brilliant, very inspiring, and encouraging, because Philanthropy Impact, of course, is an infrastructure support group, and we're trying to change the culture and the behavior of the advisory marketplace. So professional advisors to very wealthy people, so that there's more philanthropic giving and more impact investing. It's a tough kind of change that we're doing. So this has been really helpful. Thank you very much for that. So I have one final question. Actually, I have 2, but I can't ask the second one. What are your final words of wisdom that you can share with the audience? So Chris, starting with you.
Just that this is all doable. If we share and assume some sort of collective responsibility for the infrastructures that we, civil society and society, need to be their sort of best selves, we can fund them. It's been done. It's just been concentrated in the global north. And that's something that, if we want to see a happier globe, we need to think about changing.
Okay, thank you. Rachel.
Yeah, similarly, I think Victoria kind of said, if you need it, you can fund it, right? So that would be a good takeaway. And then to apply a lens of looking for infrastructure that's adaptive, that's locally rooted, and that is rights aware, is something we should all be very conscious of at this time.
Thank you. Victoria.
I think the big message I would say is now is the time. As we've all kind of mentioned here, civil society is under threat around the world, and it is now deeply under threat in the United States. And it's our infrastructure organizations that are helping hold the line. The National Center of Nonprofits, a tiny organization, has been filing the lawsuits that have been protecting the sector for the last 3 months. And I have seen funders step up and recognize that and give them extra support. But this is the moment. We need to connect. We need to collaborate. Many of us need to merge. We need to be advocating. We need to be sharing knowledge. We need to be sharing data. We need to be getting together. We need to be reinventing development and humanitarian aid. that takes this kind of infrastructure connective tissue funding. And it's incredibly urgent. So just dip your toe in, right? Just dabble, just try it out.
Okay, thank you. We're putting on a special breakfast in a week or so on litigation for social change. So maybe or Kelly or Mia, you could put the detail into the chat. Peter, thank you for helping to organize this whole thing. Your support has been really outstanding. Final words of wisdom in 30 seconds. Good luck.
Thank you. Don't go at it alone. You know, for those that are working, are your clients, let them work with Wings. Get them in the Wings working group. Invite them in. Invite them into Marfunder to fund infrastructure group that I started, so they can work with other people, or contact me, contact us, reach out. You know, so this is a journey you do not have to go out alone.
Great, thank you. And Renee, you get the final words before we go away.
I think the capacity for successful investing, successful grant making in infrastructure is absolutely huge. And it does rely on a good degree of experience and knowledge. And Philanthropy Impact has done a lot of work on that. It has charted out the different donor advised funds. It has created some excellent resources around how to help advisors give, how to help philanthropists give. So when thinking about terrific infrastructure support, actually Philanthropy Impact has a lot of the things that can help maximize what the panelists have talked about.
Renee, thank you very much for your support and kind words. I mean, the strength of the organization rests on people like you who have really helped us to get where we are. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Brilliant. And we'll be in touch with the video. So thank you very much with the recording. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Mia, can you turn off the recording?